Hello, and welcome to the Mothers of All Crime. This is a podcast where we deep dive into mothers involved in infamous crimes and scandals. I'm Monica, and this is Crystal.
Specifically about the Hart family.
Yes, the mothers involved, Jennifer and Sarah Hart. Those are our mothers today.
And they had 6 children, 6 adopted children,
Mm-hmm.
all ranging between 12 and 19.
Exactly, yes. Yes. We'll definitely talk a lot about those kids. But I'm just going to set the scene a little bit of what happened.
Yes.
So, March 26, 2018, a flipped over SUV was spotted at the base of a cliff in Mendocino County, California. And it had dropped over 100 feet on California State Route 1. And there were bodies found in the car or near the car, along with their 2 mothers. Jennifer, one of the mothers, was actually, while they were trying to lift the car, she fell out of the car. So it took a while for her to be identified, but they found their driver's licenses and they were able to identify them. And they found Hannah, Marcus, Jeremiah, Abigail at the time. So everyone is very confused because at the scene, there are no skid marks, and this is not a crash that has happened before. And it's absolutely horrific because they found all these dead bodies in a car at the bottom of a cliff, and no one has any idea how it happened. So it's at first looked at as a tragic accident. Until a few things came up. And one of them was that Jennifer Hart, one of the mothers, had a blood alcohol content of 0.1. And her wife, Sarah, had a very high level of, I don't know how to say it, diphenhydramine, which is basically Benadryl.
Yeah, it's the fancy name for Benadryl.
Yeah. 2 of the kids in the car also had very high levels of Benadryl in their system. So that's suspicious.
Yeah, I think it said something like 42 times the recommended dose was found in Sarah's system.
Yeah, it would have been the equivalent of her taking 42 doses, I think. And that's just what was in her stomach that they were able to detect at the time. So it was probably a lot more.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And it came to find that it was all very premeditated. Once they started looking into her cell phone records and internet searches, they had been looking up peaceful ways to die and how much it took for someone to OD on over-the-counter medications like Benadryl. So it slowly started to show that this was not an accident at all.
It was definitely not an accident at all. And the premeditation is truly, truly chilling to think about. One of the parts that really sticks out to me is in Sarah's Google searches, there's references to no-kill shelters for dogs. And their family dogs were found in their house unharmed, which I'm glad about, but it's interesting
which is
that's who was spared.
that like you're okay driving off a cliff with your children in the car, but God forbid anything happens to your dog. Don't get me wrong, I love dogs. Dogs are amazing. But I can never, it's already setting the idea of where their mindset was at the time on their priorities and how they viewed these children.
It's definitely a priorities issue. Although I may have done the same thing with my dog, but I wouldn't do any of the rest of this. But we can set the scene a little bit for how this family came to be.
Yeah, so there were 2 groups of siblings.
Yes, 2 groups of siblings.
Both were in the foster care system, and both had very unfortunate starts in their lives. And I'm a firm believer of it. You're born into the family that you have, and it's not the children's fault in the circumstances they're in.
Oh yeah, of
And
course.
unfortunately, all of these children were born into homes with issues coming from neglect, abuse, parents who are addicted to drugs. And it's really sad that so many children get brought into the system due to those circumstances. And then there is, which we talked about, is there's not enough caseworkers, there's not enough financial support to adequately care for the number of children that are in the system in the United States.
You know, that is definitely true, but I just want to point out how much money the Harts were being paid to be taking
Yes.
care of these kids,
Which
even after
I
adopting them.
learned. I learned because of this case that they obviously went through the system. So they went through the system, they fostered them, then they formally adopted them. I had no idea that even after adopting, this family was still receiving a monthly stipend of, I think, $2,000 from the state of Texas every month for adopting children.
Yeah. I don't know why I thought that that was only for foster children, but I thought
Yeah,
that
I
too. I didn't think it
thought the same
applied to
thing.
adopted children, but I saw it
Which,
on many different reports, and the children had all been legally adopted.
yeah. And it's interesting where during the foster system, though it's overwhelming for caseworkers and they don't always get to all of their reports, they're at least still checking up on these families. The minute
Mm.
they're adopted, that stops. So you have financial funding when you're getting checked up on from the state, but it's interesting that after adopting, they're no longer being checked up on by an outside source, and they're still getting a relatively good number every month for a single family household supporting 8 people.
Yeah. It brings me to something that I always think about with foster care and CPS, and I do think that foster families should be like that money should go to them to help them take care of children in the system. I think that that makes a ton of sense. I think that it should make it less of a barrier if someone wanted to get into helping through the foster care system, and
Yeah.
I to not have it be a financial burden as well as like a huge time commitment. But it always makes me sad when children are being removed from homes for issues related to poverty, and then the
Mm-hmm.
money is being given to someone else's family to help them raise your child.
Right.
Which is like, well, maybe if we could have just supported the mother. I don't know if that would have helped in this case. I don't think that it actually would have, but I it's just sad because I do think money solves things sometimes.
Yeah,
And
unfortunately it does. And I think that's so directly related to this situation where
Mhm.
one of the sets of siblings was removed from their family home, not only for poverty, but also for addiction. And the mother was just completely found to be unfit. They were
Yeah.
placed with a relative, and that relative had to go to work, couldn't find a babysitter, and left them in the care for temporary, I think it was like overnight, with their mother because they had no other option. CBS found out
Like,
about it and pulled them from the home and put them back into foster care
it's
rather
again
than,
a financial problem. Like,
right, rather
can
than
we
giving
not
support
provide
to this to keep
daycare
that
or
family
something?
together.
Yeah, I mean, kinship care is no joke. Like that is something that if their aunt, and I know who you're talking about, she was willing to take all of the children, but she could not. I mean, who can afford to just support 3 extra kids
Right,
that they had no intention of having? It's a lot.
right. And
It's a
it's
lot.
interesting where if a one CP, I worked with child services extensively in my career, and once they are involved in a family, they're there forever. And it's
Right.
something that's kind of unspoken. And it's interesting looking into it where the things that happen, this could happen in another family where, all right, they live with their aunt and uncle, mom watches them for a night with no CPS, it's not a big deal. No one would bat an eye. But the minute that CPS is, you make one mistake and it's over. There is no forgiving. There is no working to correct the issue. And that's another problem that the US doesn't focus, although we have a federal statute for reunification and familial placement, most of the time that's not what happens. And it's too bad.
I think that there's a desire for like expedience when it comes to children in foster care, and it makes a lot of sense in some ways. Like, obviously I don't want children to be in limbo where they don't know where they're going to live and they don't have a permanent home, because I imagine that has to be very unsettling. But I also think that if your parents, if their issue is poverty, or if it's, especially if it's substance abuse, it's not a quick fix.
Right.
It's going to be a process. It's going to be months. And if recovery and reunification is possible, it doesn't make sense to me to rush past that as if it's not very, very important and beneficial to everyone.
Well, and here's where it gets interesting, and how I think Jen and Sarah kind of slipped through the cracks of the system is the foster care system is funded by the rate of either unification, adoption, basically how quickly can children leave the foster system. And on paper, what looks better, that's how they get their funding. And situations where background checks, vetting these people who are adopting, that sometimes they're more focused on getting these kids out of their caseload and less about where they're actually going.
Yeah.
And so Sarah and Jen are appearing, but they're generally upfront, nice people at the beginning, where they were a lesbian couple wanting to adopt at-risk youth from the foster care system, and appear to truly want to have the best intentions. They just want to help children, is kind of how the perspective I got from day one. But
yeah, definitely.
It's interesting how things keep going. Is once they were in the system and their names were, all right, they got one set of siblings, things started to change internally in the family, but not from the system.
Right. But also, I mean, it's worth noting that they adopted children from out of state. So the state responsible for, because they adopted two sets of siblings. Prior to that, though, they did have a foster daughter within their state, which I believe was Minnesota at the time. They had a 15-year-old foster daughter. And they essentially abandoned her because they were adopting and it would just been too much, which, okay, whatever. Terrible the way that all went down. They essentially told her she was going to be a big sister, and then they dropped her off at therapy and didn't come back for her, and she was told that she was getting a new placement. I mean, that's sick. But that's in their state, and I would assume they had a lot of supervision. But if you are adopting through foster care in another state, which I'm not sure why they did that, like, is there not foster care in the state they live in? I feel like it was intentional. Like, it was faster, 100%. Maybe there's more children available in Texas, so the list is, the people waiting is shorter and the amount of children available is longer, but they went out of state. And so then the responsibility for the kids goes from the state of Texas to the state of Minnesota, but the people in Minnesota don't know these kids. They don't already have this established relationship with them where they know them and can be more attuned to changes and problems. It's just new strangers meeting them that have really no idea what these kids are usually like. There's no baseline.
Yeah.
Like they would have had in Texas. I think it's weird that they were moved so far away. It feels like all of the supervision kind of stopped at the point where they started fostering them.
Well, that's also, I think, strategy from the couple perspective where this foster child that they had, there was starting to be looked at for possible amounts of mistreatment towards the child, and there started to be questions of how they handled them and if they were not being adequate parents, if there was any abuse happening, neglect. And I think by adopting outside of the state, none of that would have been put into question because states unfortunately don't communicate with each other very well on this kind of stuff.
That's very true. I mean, there seems to be a theme with the Harts of moving when things get inconvenient. They just switch cities, they switch states, and I mean, it's not a bad plan. It's one that I've thought of and perhaps done before, where you're like, well, if it's just not working out here, if you just pick up and you move, some of your problems are going to follow you, but some of them aren't. And or you're at least
Right.
going to give yourself some time. And I think that it seems to me anyway, that every time that CPS was involved with this family, which happened several times over the course of the years that they had the children, including in between adopting sets of 3 kids. There was
Yes.
child abuse allegations and convictions for Sarah Hart, and then they were allowed to adopt 3 more kids.
And that's, I think, again, circling back to falling through the cracks.
Right. I think that's a
They're
different state issue.
right. We went to a new state, conviction in a different state, already adopted, and
Right.
it's just the system didn't take the time to vet who these other kids were going to. And in that
Right. And
circumstance, Jen was the one who actually was accused by the child
right.
for
But
abuse,
Sarah's the one
and
that
Sarah
pled
took
to
the
it.
fall. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So what happened with that was it was 2008 in Minnesota. They Hannah, one of the children, said that Jennifer was hitting her. Sarah ended up confessing to it. Jennifer backed her up and her plea was accepted, and she did not do jail time. She did community service and had like a deferred sentence.
Yeah, a
Um,
1 year probation.
but I think it's interesting, and I haven't seen this written, or I haven't seen anyone talk about this, but that was in 2008, and I don't think that the Harts were married until 2009. So I wonder if, yeah, they got married in Connecticut in 2009 because it wasn't legal everywhere. So maybe they had a domestic partnership or something like that, but probably not. And so if they weren't married yet, I wonder if Jennifer had adopted the kids and
Oh, that's
Sarah's
interesting.
name
I'm
wasn't
not
really on it.
sure. And
Because if
because
you're not married, I mean, I guess not married people can adopt together, but it's just hard for me to believe. I don't know. I don't know how that works. But I wonder if
yeah,
because they
it's
weren't legally
definitely
married, if they were separated,
interesting to
like
think
legally.
about because individuals, like an independent female adopting by themselves, is not an easy process. And they probably would have a better chance of adopting together.
Hmm.
So that's interesting if they may not have even ran Sarah's information.
I wonder if maybe they fostered them together, and then when it came time for the official adoption, just Jennifer adopted them.
That's an interesting point. Maybe.
It's
I
just a
don't know.
theory. It's a
Yeah.
theory that I'm pitching right now, but to me it seems, I don't know. The timeline to me
Yeah.
seems interesting. I think that, I mean, there were several times, and it seems to me that Jennifer is behind a lot of the abuse, at least the allegations that are coming up. From what I'm learning, Sarah was at work a lot,
Yes.
and
So
Jen was home playing video games.
yeah. So Sarah had a short stay at home moment early. But then it pretty much flipped where Jen became the full time stay at home mom. Sarah started working full time and overtime. And numbers I was seeing, she was only making, I think the highest number I saw was $50,000 a year, supporting a family of 8. Granted, they
Yeah, I mean,
had 2,000 from Texas every month, but that's tight for anybody.
it was roughly half of their family's income, the stipend they were getting from Texas. which that's to cover the kids, and we can get into what they were not doing for the kids, but that's not supposed to also cover the adult expenses.
Right.
So, I mean, they have a lot of expenses, and I did see some mentions of credit card debt, but it really wasn't that significant. I saw about 14,000 for Sarah and 2,000 for Jen. I don't know if you saw anything like that.
I saw, about 16 for the couple. But if you think about it's not significant as a general number for their age. However, for an income of $45,000 to $50,000 a year and having $16,000 in debt, that's a pretty significant portion that you're paying, assuming you're paying your minimums. That's a big chunk that's going to that as well, and less that you would be spending on your children and your house and things like that.
You know, it's interesting you say that because I saw, I believe, okay, so just going back to the crime itself.
Yes.
A couple of days prior to the crash, March 23rd was the last time the family was seen. And that day, Sarah paid her Discover bill, her credit card bill. So, I mean, if I'm going to kill myself in a couple of days, I'm definitely not paying a credit card. So what I really want to talk with you about is like when you think these decisions were made and how this happened. So I don't know if we want to.
I guess my first question for you is, who do you think the mastermind is, Jen or Sarah? Because I definitely think one was leading the other. Or do you think it was a group effort?
So I really thought that it was Jennifer because she's the loud one and she's like the dominant one based on what everyone's saying about their personalities. Was that Jen was the one that you noticed and Sarah was the one that you did not notice, that she was much more reserved. But I think it was a joint decision.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely initially thought that it was all Jennifer.
Yeah. I think it is all Jennifer. And I think Sarah had been basically brainwashed into just being one of the group.
You know, that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. So the reason I say that is there's a lot of things with Jen specifically. And you're totally right. She was pretty much the outgoing one. She made a lot of the decisions. Even Sarah went and worked. And Jen didn't have any contact with any of her family. And according to her, it was she came out as a lesbian and they weren't accepting of that. And then when her family was interviewed, it was exactly the opposite, where they said they had no problem with her being a lesbian. It was fine with them. They critiqued her parenting styles. And that's when she cut them out of her life. And
yeah, I saw where her brother.
Pattern.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can't criticize.
No, anybody, and then that's the pattern, is like anybody who spoke badly about Jen or about Jen's parenting, they were no longer in the family's life. The family would move. And with Jen, I think there was a pattern for her where she had anybody who critiqued her or her parenting was out of their life, all the way from when she came out. So Jen's version is she came out as a lesbian and her family was not accepting of her, which caused her to cut all of them out. She has zero contact with her family when she died. And the family's version is she came out, they were completely fine with it, but they critiqued her parenting and didn't like some of the things she was doing. And that's when she cut them out of her life. And that was with anybody that did this.
Her brother is gay.
Right. And very happily involved in the family.
And Jennifer also, I think, highly influenced Sarah to cut off her family.
Yeah. And
because
again,
they couldn't have anyone else involved.
They don't want the insight. And with cases of abuse, narcissism, and manipulation, the more outside influences that the person in control has, the harder it is to control. And there's this idea of the cult of one, where the outside sees this perfect little group and the inside is abuse, manipulation, fear, all around one person. And I think that one person is Jen.
I definitely think that she's pulling the strings, or she was.
I think other examples of that is when, on one occasion, when CPS was involved, or Child Protective Services, they go obviously and interview each of the children, and typically they interview the adults individually. And Jen insisted that they be interviewed as a couple and together. And a lot of that interview was Jen talking, Sarah agreeing. And during that interview, Jen even said that she had an education degree, which is why it's okay that their children were homeschooled for portions. And it comes to find out Jen doesn't have any degree whatsoever. And Sarah is actually the one that graduated from college.
Yes. That's because Sarah, when she graduated, Jennifer just left college. Because they met in college.
Right.
And so when Sarah graduated, they both just moved together. So Jennifer never finished.
But again, it's that
she did pretend that she had.
Yeah, it's that idea of her being perfect and this great person that should be looked up to. And anybody who looks at their social media, and I think all of us fall into this idea where social media is, you start to believe it, and all of these pictures are of this super happy family, and they're going to these festivals and music events and political things, and from the outside, they are a happy, loving, caring family. Look how perfect my kids behave. But then you start looking more into it, and they look so staged. Now, like, looking back, I think if I was just scrolling through, I'd be like, oh, look at the happy family, and then just keep going. Right. But looking, like, outside, looking back in, now knowing what happened, they are so staged and so strategically posted by Jen almost every single day.
And Devonte went viral twice, which is, I mean, it seems like a lot for a child to go viral twice.
I guarantee our listeners, you guys have probably seen it, because I had no idea who this kid was until I started looking into this family. But I had seen this photo, particularly of him hugging the police officer.
Yes, they went to a Black Lives Matter protest, and there was a viral photo of Devonte, who I think was 12, hugging a white police officer. But there's varying accounts of that story, and I do think that it was totally staged.
Yeah. And again, that picture, like, for me, it reminds me of that, like, hippie photo with, like, the gun and the woman putting the flower. Like, that was my first instinct of, like, connection. And knowing that that was just something that was done. And then I started reading reports of, like, spectators from this hug situation. And Devonte was apparently already crying, had been crying, looked terrified. And Jen was basically standing there pushing him and making him go hug this police officer for her photo op. I personally couldn't find one report other than Jen's that this wasn't a forced situation on him, which I think is interesting and also really sad.
Definitely sad, and I think it's not an exaggeration to say that she used those kids as props for, especially Devonte, as props in her campaign to be popular on social media. I don't really think she had other goals for it. It's not like she monetized it.
Right, because she had the opportunity.
She declined. She declined all interviews.
Right, for protecting her children's privacy. But then you read her posts, and there is no privacy for these children at all. And
I think all of it is lies. Totally 100%. Bullshit. Made up. She had these extremely long posts that were all crazy, and they would say, and I've seen these kind of posts on other forms of social media where it'll be like someone like, my 2-year-old looked at me and said, the meaning of life is just seeking happiness, or something extremely prophetic like that,
Right.
very philosophical. And it's something that a 2-year-old has never said ever. And that's the
Right.
situations that she's presenting, that her kids are just, I don't know, they're just spousing so much knowledge, and they're
Mm-hmm.
saying all these profound things on the daily,
Yeah.
and she's so moved by them.
And I think this kind of supported her constant posting, supported the image that everyone had of her. There's a lot of, when the accident first came out, as the investigation was happening, so many people came out of the woodworks saying that they were amazing people. Her high school teacher came out saying that she was a good person, which was like 20 something years ago. How do you know who they are today? But that's beside the point.
Right,
Um,
exactly.
but a lot of them referred to their social media page. A lot of them referred to, oh, they were doing all this stuff. They traveled with the kids. I saw it on X, Y, and Z. And it's that same idea of, we always kind of put, I think, as a society, a little too much faith in what we see online. And from personal experience and friends of mine, what is posted and the reality are not the same thing. Almost never are they the same thing.
Very true. That's like when you see someone who's constantly posting about how amazing their relationship is,
Mm-hmm.
and then they break up and they start
Like,
talking about how they locked them in a closet for 6 months,
yeah,
or something absolutely horrendous, like he would hit me in front of my mom.
yeah,
And it's like, well, then why did you make me read all this stuff about him?
yeah. And I think
I
that
believed you.
connects it. Right. And it's like, oh my
Yeah.
God. And it all starts to come out. And that's
Yeah,
why
I've
I
been
think,
yelling at my husband that he's not as good as your boyfriend.
right, do better.
Look at
And
the
then
love
the
notes
truth
he
comes
writes
out.
every day. Well, she was love bombing her followers, I feel like.
Yes.
It was
Yes. I think
all,
that's a great way to say it.
it was so fake. And I feel like she wanted the kids to be noticed, to get attention, to have people think that she was doing something amazing, which I, I don't really subscribe to the idea that you're doing an adopted child a favor by adopting
Mm-hmm.
them. Having a child is a privilege,
Yes.
and it's not, you're not doing them a favor. It should be a
It was like
joy
that,
to
wanted to
bring
be a
this child
martyr,
in.
basically. She wanted the
Right.
praise of it. And she definitely did her due diligence of touching so many communities that feel marginalized. Um,
Mm,
for example, she was a lesbian. She adopted minority children. She told the world that they were vegan, that they att- were working towards a self sustaining life, and her kid's dream was raising their own food. Um, and then as you look at things, some of them are true, don't get me wrong, but when their house got looked at after the crash, the vegans had lunch meat and all kinds of cheese, like all this stuff in their house, hot dogs, not very
yeah.
vegan like.
Their
But
fridge, their
online,
pantry, all of it was stocked.
yeah, but online,
Which also,
she got another demographic to support them, which is interesting.
she wanted to be a martyr. She wanted to be a minority. She wanted to be looked at and admired for all the things that she's overcome and all the miracles that she's helped happen.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's the kind of person who is so narcissistic that it's very scary.
Yes.
I kind of prefer self-deprecating a little bit. Feels more real to me.
Mm-hmm.
People who are trying to constantly prove to you how perfect and amazing they are all the time actually kind of scare me.
Yeah. And that's, I think, that exact point is where I think it started moving dangerous, where
Mm.
Jen had a plan. And because all of the how to protect their dogs, how to peacefully not feel pain in an accident. All of these searches were being done by Sarah. All of these things to try to protect them as much as they could were coming from Sarah. And Jen was the one driving. Jen was the one who put everybody in the car, who I'm assuming made the decision to leave because it had just pattern wise. Jen was the one. There was a situation in, I think, Washington, where one of the kids basically in the middle of the night ran to a neighbor's house in a panic saying that they were being abused. And then Jen came over, took the kid in a room, and then when the kid left, looked terrified, apologized for their behavior. They were sad because their cat was sick, I think it was. And from there, that's when they started to wrap everything up because it was time to move because CPS was coming.
It is so heartbreaking how many times these children tried to get help and went and told people what was going on, and there was no real accountability ever being put back on Jen and Sarah.
Right.
It was I guess maybe accountability was coming for them, but they kept evading it by moving. But they told neighbors that they were being abused, that their moms were racist, that they were hitting them, that they were starving them. There was instances where they were, I think, being abusive to the kids in front of their friends. There was accounts of them underfeeding their children in front of their friends and then forcing their kids to lay on an air mattress for 5 hours after eating extra pizza, which is a weird punishment. That's not. I think that they were losing all control, and the kids were getting older, and it was getting harder and harder to keep them all in the house because the neighbors would say that they wouldn't see the kids outside.
None of them.
And in all of these places, they lived in very places where people love to be outdoors. They're in.
And again, she told everybody they were going to live off the land. How do you do that if you never leave the house?
And these kids were so thin. They were so skinny. And they were not vegan. They were just extremely underfed. Starved.
And I think that's part of it is from the outside, these kids looked years younger than they actually were, which made it a lot easier for them to control them from an outside perspective because people assumed they were just misbehaved young kids who don't know any better. Turns out they were all teenagers. And I think the other fact that you mentioned is they did start acting out more. They did start reaching out. They never asked for help per se, but they started telling people about the abuse. They started asking for food. Don't tell my mom, but if you could leave me some non-perishable stuff that I can hide, that would be great. And I think the siblings trying to protect each other the best way they knew how without losing each other.
Well, that's the other thing is they didn't want to be separated.
Yeah.
And 3 of the siblings, which one? There's 3 of the siblings. Jeremiah, Devontae, and Sierra, they had an older brother, and he was not adopted by the Harts. He was put in a residential treatment facility. He was put in a facility for juveniles that were unadoptable, basically. And they knew that that was what could have happened to them as well. And that they were, I guess, lucky to all be together. But it's really sad to think that they would all probably be alive if they had been put in those residential treatment centers, which I don't even really, I think that's pretty inhumane to keep children in those kind of places, but they would at least have been fed. And I think that they were systematically starved. I think it was a form of punishment, but also just a form of control. If you keep the kids really weak, if you keep them really weak where they can't get away, it makes it harder to rebel. They had less physical energy to rebel.
Absolutely. And I think that control aspect is what started to unravel, where
Yeah,
the kids were getting older and they were going to start losing that money. So
exactly.
Marcus, who was the oldest, was 19 at the time. And after he turned, as he got older, people started asking him, "Oh, it's time to leave the house soon. What are your plans?" And Jen's reaction was, "Well, he's never going to leave the house." And as the kids turned 18, the funding would go down because the state funding only was supported for children under the age of 18. And there goes their money. That's 50% of their income gone. And now, what do
And
you
the
do?
youngest was 12. So, I mean, in not that long, this money's going to dry up.
Mm-hmm.
There's no plan B.
And I think Jen started to spiral, where I think she started to realize that, and this is my theory, she could only keep control of these people for so much longer until things basically blew up in her face. You can only escape the police for so long. You can only escape CPS for so long. You can only control people for so long. And I think that's where she made like an intentional decision, but maybe not shared it yet. I think her plan was, if I'm going to go down, I'm going to take everyone with me. And I think Sarah didn't realize it until they were actively having it about to happen. Like you said, she
I
paid a credit card bill. Why would she do that if she had known or had insight into the plans?
They also bought the Benadryl that same day on March 23rd, and they didn't die till the 26th. I
Yeah.
wonder if there was other attempts. They're almost unaccounted for. There's a few sightings of them, but they were just driving around California. No one really knows how they spent their days, and they had the
Mm-hmm.
6 children with them. So who knows what other ways they had tried already.
Right.
So I don't even know. Maybe they'd been taking Benadryl for days and they just weren't dying from it. So they had to come up with something else.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that there are no skid marks going off this cliff. And it was very clear that Jen was the only one highly intoxicated. So she got to a point, started to accelerate, and never hit the brake. She just drove straight.
It was definitely intentional. It was definitely premeditated. This is definitely a case of family annihilation. The only possible question I have is why did Sarah go along with this? She was just so under Jen's control.
And that's where I think it really is if Sarah was on board with the plan, I don't think she would have gone the OD route. I think she would have drank with her. I think she would have not tried to protect, in a way, the children. Because I'm personally looking through stuff, 99% of it, all of the abuse claims, all of the terrible, terrible things these kids endured, every single time they pointed to Jen. And Sarah would defend her. Sarah was never the one. Granted, she never stopped it, which is just as bad in my opinion, but she never actually did anything. So you could
Mm.
argue that during that time, Jen would be starving out the kids, and when she was playing her video games for hours on end, Sarah would go and feed them or give them something or happen to forget something and bring them to do, like, I just feel like there's some kind of disconnect of Sarah over the years. It's amazing what you can get someone to do if you're constantly telling them something.
Maybe Sarah was just along for the ride,
Yeah.
as pathetic as that is in this case. Um, but I think you're probably right. I think that Jen orchestrated this. I think that Sarah participated and she was an adult and she could have made different choices that would have saved all of their lives. Um, I mean, there's no reason that they had to take the kids with them.
No. But I really think that's where we have to be careful of, like, it's so easy to look back and be like, Sarah should have done something. But
Yeah.
it's amazing how the mind can be so controlled and how a mental abuse can be sometimes one of the worst because they don't realize what's happening until it's too late. And it's hard to mentally separate yourself from that, which is a bizarre thing to say. It's easier to take a punch than it is to break your mind.
I agree with that. I think that Sarah may have been one of Jen's victims. I
Yeah.
just also want to assign her responsibility, but I don't know the ins and outs of their relationship. And
Right. At what point do you go from being a victim to being the abuser yourself?
unfortunately, we're never going to know
Yeah.
because there were no survivors of this crash. Although, devastatingly, Devante has never been found. All of the other all of the other children have been confirmed dead because at least parts of their bodies have washed up, but there's never been a trace of Devante.
Which is interesting, kind of going back to your idea of if this had happened more than once or more than one attempt.
Mm,
The court did decide that Devante was in the car at the crash, but at the same time, there's always that possibility. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe something else had happened and he's somewhere else that they just aren't looking.
wow. Maybe. I've never seen that theory anywhere, but it's possible.
Yeah.
Because there were theories that like maybe Devante escaped the car, but I think that if he was in the car, he definitely died, and it's possible he was just like washed out to sea. But it's
Right.
also possible that he died somewhere else and they ditched him.
Because all his stuff would probably have still been in the car, which is would all bring him to put him in the car from an evidence perspective. If they only left the body somewhere else and they had
Right.
all of his things, who knows?
I think that I mean, if his body had been found by someone, I think it would have been connected, but I guess it depends on how long.
Right.
That's interesting.
Because his
But
death
yeah, I think it's
certificate was
possible.
only signed in April of 23. His, like, they just deemed him as deceased relatively recently.
Right, right.
But I
Um,
think the family annihilator idea is so interesting when it comes to mothers and women, and it's so drastically understudied from that angle, where all of our knowledge and information, the characteristics and motivations of a family annihilator, is all off of research for men. And the research that is done on women have such a small population. There's so many concerns about the validity of them because how do you make a group when you're only talking to 7 people? It's interesting.
it is interesting. And I think that there are more cases like this and cases of other types of family annihilation committed by women that are just kind of described differently. And so
Mm-hmm.
they don't get categorized the same way. I at least did see Jennifer and Sarah Hart on some of the lists of family annihilators. Um,
Yeah.
and it was categorized that way, different than Diane Schuler.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still, I don't think they're thought of as mass murderers. It's still
No.
not, I don't know. I think if a man did this, it would just be perceived very differently. And I don't even know if we'd be trying to find any justifications for it.
Right. And because again, if a man were to do it, they would assume it was from aspects of they knew the financial burden was coming. So there's a financial concern, the need for power over the situation. Maybe they felt like they no longer had control and power over their family. The fear of or anger that their family was going to be broken up. So I'm going to take everyone with me if I can't be with my whole family. There's a lot of motivations for those men, but not necessarily consistent when you're looking at just the women.
I do think for Jen, it was all ego motivated. She just
Mm-hmm.
couldn't face the music. She couldn't deal with any of the criticism.
Yeah.
I don't think it was financially for her motivated, maybe for Sarah, but I think for Jen, it was just people are going to find out.
Find out the truth. Yeah, I totally
Yeah.
agree. Because she played this part, and anytime someone got a little too close to finding out the truth, she moved them, and no one ever saw them again. So devastating case. So
Super
sad.
devastating.
I
But
think the person I feel the worst for is the eldest brother who's still there. And he actually was in jail when this happened. Didn't find out that his three younger siblings had been basically murdered until after he was released. Which
well,
is
when they were adopted, there stopped being any reason to inform the biological families, which
right.
is so sad too, because they all found out weeks, if not months, after the crash.
Yeah. They found out, I think, with everybody else, which is, I can't even imagine having that to process that as a loved one who, and his brother was always, he never really gave up hope about being back with his family. And that this couple took that hope away from him.
They could have reconnected as adults, and
Absolutely.
they'll never get that opportunity. And ugh, makes me so sad to think about these children starving in suburbia and just the abuse and neglect that they should have been spared a million times.
Yeah.
Somehow the state of Texas was paying these people to abuse them.
Right. And never followed up with it. So,
Ugh, makes me sick.
all right. So, what are your final takes on the Hart family, or specifically the couple? Because we love the
So
children. We've deemed
we love the children.
that.
So I think that my my thought is that Jen is the mastermind, that she could not take any criticism, and that she either coerced or manipulated Sarah to doing it as well. And I think that maybe Sarah had some financial motivations and panic over it. And
Yeah, I gotta
that's what I
agree.
think.
I gotta agree. And
Yeah,
I think the social media really enforced that
totally.
Jen really was in it for the attention, very egotistical, where it was, she lived this amazing life and she was just basically a martyr and everyone should look up to her. And the reality is the farthest from the truth.
I think the real takeaway is beware anyone that's trying to convince you their life is perfect, because nobody is perfect. Everybody's got their shit. And if you're spending all of this time perfecting your image for social media, I don't know. I'm a little skeptical about what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm. And then
That's
from
my
an
final thought.
outside group, if there's a kid who's telling you they're being abused, call the police.
I
Even if
know.
they tell you don't call the police, they are a child, call the police. And
They're sad though
unfortunately,
because
that happens so many times with these kids.
I know, but when CPS was actually coming for them, that's when they ran and ended up killing everyone.
Yeah.
So I think the people who didn't call have a lot of guilt and they feel a lot of guilt, and I think the people who did call feel a lot of guilt
Also
and have
feel
a lot of
guilt,
guilt.
which is
And
a horrible
it's very
thought.
unfair. Yeah, either way, it's horrible because it's not anyone else's fault except for Jen and Sarah, because they were
Correct.
the mothers and they were the adults and they put all of their kids in this car and drove off a cliff, quite literally.
Yeah. Just one of the many examples of not everyone should be a mother.
Definitely not. Yeah, and not everyone can take care of 6 kids. It's too much.
God, even sane people having 6 kids sounds. I can't even imagine having one, let alone 6.
If you're overextended at 3, adding 3 more isn't going to help.
Yep. All right. Well, that's everything I have for the Hearts. The
Me
so
too.
sad family.
So breaking my heart.
But our list is ever growing. And I cannot wait to talk to you about our next mother and child relationship.
I know, we got some good ones coming up. We'll talk soon.
All right, bye.
All right, bye.